over some things that we have gone over this year. I have included a worksheet, a little noisy where we are, we'll do the best we can. I've included a worksheet that you should have downloaded and you can now put answers on. So we're going to start with kind of the earlier part of the year. Alright, so we're going to move for a second and then we'll pick it right back up. We're on a field trip. We're in New York City. And behind me, New York Harbor, the greatest natural harbor on either side of the Atlantic. First question on your worksheet. Who is the first European to enter New York Harbor? For what country was he sailing? And what country was he from? Now, I'm sure you've all answered correctly. That was, of course, Henry Hudson, an Englishman sailing for the Dutch. Now, if you see in the distance a big bridge, that's the Verrazano Bridge. That connects Staten Island to the right and Brooklyn to the left. Named, of course, for Vinnie Verrazano and his cousin Paulie, who introduced the meatball parm sandwich to Brooklyn in 1932. All right, behind me is Brooklyn. Those buildings over there. We go to the right, that's Manhattan. Now, all right, so you have Brooklyn to the left and Manhattan to the right. The river that we're looking at with that boat sailing up it, that's the river that George Washington had to cross in August of 1776 to escape the British from the Battle of New York. So he's in Brooklyn where he just got decimated. He wants to get to Manhattan. What's the river that he had to cross? Covered a lot of rivers this year. All right, you should have your answer down by now. And of course, the correct answer was the East River. All right, here's a question that we didn't cover this year. Let's see if you can figure it out. We pointed Brooklyn out over there, Manhattan over here. The East River is underneath me. Where am I? Am I standing on top of the East River? I'll give you a couple hints. Here we have steel cable. 14,000 miles of steel cable. So you got granite, you got steel cable. Pause. We are taking a field trip today. You might have figured it out where we are at this point. Granite, steel, standing over the East River. Gotta be a bridge of some sort. Hey, this isn't any bridge. This is the greatest bridge in the world. This is the Brooklyn Bridge. And we are right now in the 150th anniversary of the building of the Brooklyn Bridge. So we are headed into Lower Manhattan, which of course, as you all know, was originally better known as New Amsterdam. So get your worksheets ready to go, and we are heading into the city. And hopefully you can hear me. We're just coming off the Brooklyn Bridge. And I want you to see this building. This was once the tallest building in the world. And I don't think your parents would even remember this. It was built with nickels and dimes, literally. And the guy who built it paid cash for it. He didn't have to go to a bank to borrow money. He didn't have that much money. His name was Woolworth. And before there was a Walmart, and before there was a Target, and before there was this, that, and the other thing, there was Woolworth's Five and Dime. And that building was once the tallest building in the world. You can see the tallest building in the United States
Freedom Tower right behind you.
Hey, we're just off the Brooklyn Bridge down here in Lower Manhattan, very close to City Hall. We'll be going there in a little bit. The building behind me is the Surrogate Court of New York. I don't know what that is. I can ask Mrs. Ironson. I'm sure she knows. And if you look at the top, there are several statues of individuals who have been critical in the history of New York City. So again, most of the names you wouldn't recognize, but if you look to the third guy over, you might notice that his right leg is a peg leg. Now, here's a question from your worksheet. What was the name of the Dutch manager who made New Amsterdam into a thriving colony? He was known as Peg Leg Peter. There, I gave you his first name. Okay, of course, I'm sure you've written down on your worksheet, that is Peter Stuyvesant. Now, the guy to the left of him is arguably, actually to our left, to his right, is probably the most important person in the history of New York City. His name is DeWitt Clinton. No relation to Bill or Hillary. And why he is so important in New York City history is for two things. We should all thank him because he is the guy, as New York City started to expand, he said, you know what, instead of having all streets going in any which way, whatever direction, let's put a grid. So he's the guy that made the grid for New York City. People say they're scared of driving in New York City. You're nuts. It's the easiest city in the world to drive in. It's a grid. You want to drive in a city that's hard? Go to Boston. Go to Washington, D.C. The other thing that DeWitt Clinton did was, as America expanded westward, over the Appalachian Mountains into the Ohio Territory, there was no way to get goods from the Ohio Territory to the East Coast. They had to go through what river and what city? Question on your worksheet. Of course, the answer is down the Mississippi out through New Orleans. This led to the Louisiana Purchase. What he does in the 1820s, is he says, I'm going to connect the western United States, which is essentially the United States west of the Appalachians, to the East Coast. And what he did was have them dig a canal from Lake Erie, which is in Buffalo, New York, to Albany on the Hudson River. And that connected New York City to the rest of the continent. And that, of course, was the Erie Canal, and that's what made New York City, New York. You could now trade with the West via the Erie Canal, and that's all DeWitt Clinton. So he's a very important figure, not just New York City history, but American history. Hey, we are still in Lower Manhattan, and the building to my left here is a New York City municipal building. If you want to pan up and take a look. This was built in the early 1900s. They were originally going to replace City Hall with it, but somebody was smart enough. Hey, knock it off! Somebody was smart enough to say, save City Hall. So who works in this building are just the regular employees of New York City. The mayor still works in City Hall. If you look to the left, you can see New Amsterdam, and that's a Roman numeral that says 1625. To the right, it says Manhattan. And then to the right of that, through the light posts, you see New York. And again, that was the year that New York City was consolidated. At one point, New York, Brooklyn, Queens, they were all separate. But this represents New York City being consolidated into one. We're going to walk up, and between the columns, there's some stone-cut medallions, and I want you to take note of two of them. All right, the one on the left is a windmill. And of course, you associate windmills with the Netherlands. And of course, those are the people that first came and settled this colony and called it New Amsterdam. But the one on the right, the one to the right of the windmill, that's the one I want you to take notice of. And again, this is carved in stone. New York City understands its history. What was the economic item that made New Amsterdam go? It's carved into that medallion. It's a question on your worksheet. And if you can see, I think the picture's clear enough. That's a beaver. And again, that is carved in stone in the New York City Municipal Building. That's how important the beaver trade was. All right, we are still on Broadway, and if you'll notice the street sign Broadway, underneath it, it says Canyon of Heroes. This is the route that ticker tape parades will take. All right, as you're walking on Broadway, this part of Broadway, not up where the theaters are, but this part of Broadway, what you will see is these carved into the sidewalk are people who were honored with ticker tape parades. So this one says October 20th, 1953, General Mark Clark, retiring commander of U.S. forces in the Far East. That's during the Korean War. He was in charge of all American forces during the Korean War after General MacArthur was dismissed. My parents used to live in Charleston, South Carolina, and to get there you went over the Mark Clark Bridge. So this is Lower Broadway, the Canyon of Heroes. Here's a question for you. What was the last group to receive a ticker tape parade here on Broadway? Miss LaRusso is going to be very upset if you don't know that the last group to receive a ticker tape parade here on Broadway was the U.S. women's soccer team, not that long ago. All right, the building behind me is New York City Hall, where Mayor de Blasio works. This is the oldest continually operating city hall in the United States. It was completed in 1812. The first occupant was DeWitt Clinton. Now, on those steps is where these ticker tape parades that we mentioned earlier always end up. That everybody, they set up the chairs and everybody sits on the steps and they get awarded the keys to the city. I would have thought that the next group to receive a ticker tape parade in 2020 would be, of course, the New York Yankees. But it was recently announced, I believe this is accurate, that the next ticker tape parade is going to be for healthcare workers. That when this pandemic is somewhat behind us, I believe that healthcare workers, essential workers, are going to receive a ticker tape parade, and when they do, they will end up right here. There's a statue over to your right. We're going to pan over to, you only see the back of it. That's a statue of an individual named Nathan Hale. He was a teacher during the Revolutionary War, but he was also a spy. And he was captured by the British during the Battle of New York. Here's a question on your worksheet. Then and now, what happens to spies? You are correct. They are hanged. And he was hanged. And he very famously said, supposedly, just before he was hanged by the British, my one regret is that I have but one life to give to my country. That is Nathan Hale. We're going to take a peek at another statue that is right across the street in 1 second. The stone building behind me, which says Pace University, that was the original location of the New York Times. It's now located more uptown, but this is where the New York Times operated out of. This whole street was where all the newspapers would have been, because right behind, if we look over here, is of course City Hall. And so of course all the newspapers are going to be located essentially across the street from City Hall, because that's where all the news was coming. This was the print capital, if you will, of New York City. But, of course, when we think of the king of print in the United States, who is it that we think of? You have a second to write that down. There's a question on your worksheet. And if we zoom in on the statue across the street, right here in Lower Manhattan, that is a statue of Benjamin Franklin. You think of Benjamin Franklin, of course you think of Philadelphia, but here he is in Lower Manhattan, right next door to City Hall, because this is where all the printing took place. And he probably had a printing press somewhere in this area at some point. Want to roll it? That's not a statue, that's actually a squirrel. My wife likes squirrels. If we weren't going to have children, we figured we'd have squirrels. A lot cheaper. She's torturing the poor squirrel because she's beckoning him to come over, and he's used to being fed, and she ain't got nothing. Okay, behind me is Trinity Church, and This was the tallest building in New York City. At the time the Brooklyn Bridge was being built. Hard to imagine today, but this was by far the tallest building in New York City. It's the third version of Trinity Church. The first two actually burned down. This was built in 1847, and this time they made it out of stone. So this has been around now about 170, 180 years. One of the more popular sites to come to when you visit New York City, in part because you want to see the church, but maybe more importantly, if you look over here, you see a headstone with a little obelisk on the top. That is the tomb of Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton is buried right here in Trinity Church. His wife is right next to him. Of course, we know what happened to him. Or do we? Here's the question that's on your sheet. Who killed Alexander Hamilton, and where did it take place? Okay. And of course, you've had the opportunity to write the answer down. I'm sure you all got, he was killed by Aaron Burr in a duel in Weehawken, New Jersey in 1804. They actually rode him across the Hudson River to a friend of his a few blocks up the street where he died there. He didn't die in Weehawken. The bells are ringing and we're going to stop there. All right, we are right outside the front of Trinity Church, and if you look at the street sign above me, we are on Wall Street. The road right to my left is Broadway. So we are at Broadway and Wall. The wall would have been right where we are standing. And we're not that far to the southern tip of Manhattan. What was New Amsterdam did not take up a lot of territory. So we are at Wall Street. All right, we're still on Wall Street, a few paces away from Trinity Church. And where I'm standing is in front of what is called Federal Hall. Now the building behind me is not the original Federal Hall. The original Federal Hall was demolished in the 1830s. This is what replaced it. But this would have been essentially where the government worked when New York City was the capital. Now, here's a question on your worksheet. From this location, not this building, because the original building has been knocked down, who gave a very famous speech? We just read Lincoln's inaugural address. Who gave an inaugural address from this site? And of course, by now, you should have written down that speech was given by none other than George Washington. And I will take a walk up the steps and stand next to Washington, and you can see just how tall he really was. What do you think? Presidential material or not? Hey, Federal Hall right behind me, just so you have an idea where we are. We are on Broad Street right now. The road that goes in front of Federal Hall is Wall. Hey, we're just a few steps from Federal Hall and that statue of Washington overlooking Wall Street. But when you think of Wall Street, you probably don't think of George Washington and his first inaugural address. You think of this building behind me, and that is the New York Stock Exchange, which is right behind me, right across the street from Federal Hall. George Washington is keeping a very watchful gaze, if you will, over the New York Stock Exchange. Okay, also keeping a watchful gaze on the New York Stock Exchange is this young lady. She is affectionately known as the Defiant Girl. She was originally placed not too many years ago in front of the Charging Bull, which we'll visit a little bit later. About 2 years ago, she was moved to this location, where she is looking directly at Wall Street, the New York Stock Exchange. We're actually on Broad Street, but the New York Stock Exchange, that is one Wall Street. So this is the Defiant Girl, and yes, she's wearing a mask, and you should too. Manhattan, the building behind me is called Oculus. It is the transportation center where Jetsons. All right, we are continuing our trip here to Lower Manhattan, the original New Amsterdam. What's behind me? The building with the slanted roof that slants off to the right. That's the World Trade Center Memorial Museum. Directly behind me is the World Trade Center Memorial. If you can see through the trees, that is one of the two fountains that are the footprints of the original towers. 37-foot high waterfalls that fall into the original footprints. We can't get any closer than where we are now. The park part is actually closed off. But this is actually a little north of what would have been New Amsterdam. This is territory that wouldn't have been developed until the British came here. If you want to look to your left a little bit, and we'll look up, that is the Freedom Tower. That was built after the World Trade Center buildings came down. And on September 11th, we talked a lot about what happened that day. And I asked, to the foot, how high is the Freedom Tower? And that's one of the questions on your sheet. So if you could answer that right now. And of course, you know the answer was 1,776 feet high. Obviously, 1776, the year of the Declaration of Independence. So, World Trade Center Memorial, a must-see. You live an hour away, you gotta get here. All right, we're gonna be moving on. All right, we're still down here at the World Trade Center site. We just moved over a few feet. What's behind me appears to be a sculpture of modern art or something like that. That is actually a sculpture that was a perfectly round globe that was actually inside of the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001, and survived but came out looking like this. And it's part of this park that overlooks the World Trade Center site. This is called like First Responders Park, and I'll show you the reason why. This is called America's Response Monument. After September 11th, a very few specialized forces went into Afghanistan, and they were America's first response to September 11th. And what you see is a guy on horseback, but he's carrying modern weapons. So this isn't a guy from the 19th, 18th century. This is a guy who, in September of 2001, was part of a very small force, supposedly it was 12 people, that went in on horseback into Afghanistan, which was America's first response. There's a movie out there called 12 Strong, and it stars Chris Hemsworth, who's the guy that plays Thor in all the Avenger movies, and it's about that, our response to our first response, if you will, to the 9/11 attacks, and that's what this park that we've been at is dedicated to. This was open. The regular World Trade Center, the big memorial, is not open at this time.
All right, we are at the very, very bottom of the island of Manhattan, the southern tip. And as you can see, this monument says, on the 22nd of April, 1625, the West India Company created what will eventually become New Amsterdam. And if we walk, it is still a parkish area. That is not to say that were they to come back, they would recognize it. And that building straight ahead, that's called Castle Clinton. Before there was an Ellis Island, that's where the immigration center was. So this is the very bottom. This is where the Dutch landed. And I don't think that they could have imagined going from this kind of tree setting to this. That it is from this spot that New York City will rise. Most of us have been in here. So